Previously, we saw the British Pacific Fleet assemble in Ceylon and sail for strikes on Japanese oil refineries. And now the continuation. As the fleet sailed to its new home in Sydney, Australia, its new home was still in the middle of building up the facilities needed, as well as all the logistics issues described in the previous video. Sydney Harbour needed considerably enhanced infrastructure to handle so many ships, especially the larger vessels like the aircraft carriers. Two main naval facilities were available: Garden Island, which is nearer the harbour entrance, and Cockatoo Island, which is just past the city somewhat further in. These were the primary dockyards. The latter, Cockatoo Island, could accommodate cruisers and anything smaller than that, but to deal with the carriers and battleships, a huge new dry dock, almost 1,140 feet long, was being built at Garden Island. This was only a handful of feet shorter than the massive dry dock at Saint-Nazaire that had been the target of HMS Campbelltown earlier in the war. Although it was due to be officially opened at the end of March 1945, it was actually first used about 6 weeks earlier when the carrier Illustrious showed up. After a long war, much damage, and a series of relatively hasty patch-up jobs, her central propeller shaft was out of kilter and leaking. But there just wasn't time to properly patch up the ship before it would be needed on the front lines, and so the central propeller was just taken off entirely, the shaft locked in place, and the opening sealed. This would restrict the ship to 24 knots, using just her outer propellers until the issue could be more properly remedied, but for now she was still able to operate with the fleet. Other ships in the fleet were given less urgent overhauls, including a smattering of additional 40mm Bofors for pretty much any vessel that tied up long enough for a crane to swing over them. The men ashore in charge of stores walked a tightrope of ensuring a constant stream of ships were given just enough supplies to do what they actually needed to do, without handing over quite so much of the warehouse stock that following ships would run short when they showed up in turn. With that said, the relatively short turnaround from deciding to deploy the British Pacific Fleet at all to it actually showing up meant that stores of all kinds rapidly ran quite short. Entire cargo ships full of specific stores, especially those that were needed for the carrier's air wings, were drained almost the instant they touched a quayside. To aid in keeping the carrier's air wings up to speed while their home ships were docked, a series of cargo ships arrived with the men, vehicles and supplies to set up what had been labelled Mobile Offshore Naval Air Bases, or MONABs. This was essentially supposed to be a pre-packaged major airfield with everything needed except for the actual runways. Luckily for these men, who had in fact been given small arms training in anticipation of having to set up facilities right behind the front lines of an amphibious assault in the manner to some of the US CB detachments, their first assignments were actually just to set up training airfields in Australia, where, for all the other hazards, the emus, kangaroos, saltwater crocodiles, and the wide variety of snakes and spiders had at least yet to become proficient in the use of firearms. Men from HMS Unicorn also came ashore to help the process along, since the ship was already well practiced at not only aircraft support and maintenance in general, but that of the specific aircraft in the British Pacific Fleet, which was something that the local Royal Australian Air Force personnel, eager as they were to assist, were somewhat less familiar with. In theory, there should also have been a body of replacement aircrew on hand to make up losses, but they just hadn't had time to arrive yet, and a short-term solution was therefore found in the aircrews aboard the 7 escort carriers that by this point had reached the fleet. 5 of them were loaded with fighters only, and while one of them was retained in this role to provide combat air patrol for the fleet while the big carriers got on with mostly offensive operations, the other 4 had their air crews redistributed to the fleet carriers or sent ashore to help train up new carrier air groups for rotation aboard the next time the fleet came calling. The escort carriers so affected were then retasked as maintenance, replenishment and support vessels until more aircrew arrived or were trained up locally. Next was the matter of a more forward support base. The front line in the Pacific was by now very far away from Australia, and sending ships all the way back for repairs and replenishment every time they needed it would be a little bit ridiculous. Luckily, the US Navy was just in the process of moving out of Manus, just to the northeast of New Guinea. They were heading for other bases like Leyte. Manus was about 2,500 miles sailing closer to the front lines, and just over halfway from Sydney to the next intended target of the Allied advance, Okinawa. 2 of the MONAB units were thus swiftly dispatched there to take over the facilities and equipment that the US Navy was leaving behind. But it was still about 2,300 miles to Okinawa. Luckily, the American Seabees were hard at work capitalizing on the recent advances in the Philippines, and a series of advanced bases had been established in Leyte Gulf. This was only about 1,000 miles from Okinawa, closer actually even than Leyte, and it was agreed that everyone, US Navy, Royal Navy and everybody else, would share these facilities. The fleet train, under one Admiral Douglas Fisher, no relation to Jackie Fisher of World War I fame, would have to shuttle supplies from Australia to Manus and then on to Leyte, as well as support the fleet on the front line. Since the war in Europe was beginning to wrap up and more escort carriers were not only becoming available, but also being freed up from existing duties, another half dozen of these vessels were allocated to ferry aircraft and supplies along this route, which had the advantage of the pilots simply being able to fly off to the fleet carriers at the end of the voyage, as opposed to a ship with crated aircraft having to land them and then have the aircraft assembled or ferried out by lighter. One final task which kept the Australian dockyards busy was trying to patch up and standardise the ships of said fleet train. Whatever standardisation might have been present in the Royal Fleet Auxiliary at the start of World War II was long gone in a mishmash of losses and ships brought in to replace said losses. Unlike the US, which had built vast fleets of logistics vessels, which made interoperability relatively easy, the rather mixed bag of logistic ships now available to the Royal Navy and Royal Fleet Auxiliary were in various states of repair and age, needed reconditioning to deal with the tropical heat, and in the case of the tanker fleet, also needed their pumps and hoses both upgraded and relocated to allow for a somewhat swifter flow of fuel to ships attached on almost all sides, a process that would take several months to completely pan out. All of this was just about managed, and the British Pacific Fleet arrived at Manus on the 7th of March 1945, ready for orders in its first major operation operating alongside the US Navy. Initially, Admiral King intended to direct them to help retake Borneo, but attrition had reduced the US Navy's fast carrier force, as the fleet carriers Saratoga, Randolph, Franklin, Wasp, and Yorktown had all been hit to varying degrees at various points in the last couple of months, and all had to either go all the way home for repairs or at least to Leyte. And so Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Spruance, who was at that point in charge of what was at this stage the Fifth Fleet, pressed hard to have the British Pacific Fleet brought in to ensure the upcoming offensive would actually have more ships present than before the Japanese Navy and Army had begun their most recent attrition efforts. These appeals prevailed, and the British Pacific Fleet was slotted into the overall force for Operation Iceberg. With the Battle of Leyte Gulf a few months before having gone decidedly non-optimally for the Imperial Japanese Navy's surface fleet and carriers, there was relatively little chance of any substantive resistance along those lines. Instead, the main threats to the invasion of Okinawa were from aircraft based on the island itself, plus aircraft and ships from either mainland Japan, a few hundred miles to the north, which was the invasion's right flank, or from the Sakashima Islands and possibly Formosa, now Taiwan, the former of which was a few hundred miles to the southwest on the invasion's left flank. The US Navy would obviously have to deal with the Japanese forces on Okinawa itself, but in order to prevent the Fifth Fleet from having to try and look for potential threats from two nearly opposite directions at once while also trying to cover the landings, the British Pacific Fleet was assigned to suppress the enemy airfields in the Sakashima and later Formosa areas as well. They would also stand between the invasion force and any aircraft that might still try to attack from this direction. This was entirely in keeping with general US Navy doctrine, and indeed Spruance's attack patterns in particular. As we've seen in his own video series, he'd often used varying elements from his own forces to conduct similar flank guard and suppression activities in everything from the invasion of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands all the way up to that massive hammering that was given to Truk, which was now some distance behind the front lines and feeling very isolated. The fleet now theoretically had 5 fleet carriers on strength, the full Illustrious class, namely Illustrious, Victorious, Formidable and Indomitable, plus the larger Indefatigable, although Formidable was still catching up with the rest of the fleet and wouldn't be available for some weeks hence. All aircraft were painted with the unique British Pacific Fleet roundel, whose primary feature was the deletion of the red dot in the centre of the regular British markings to prevent misidentification or confusion with the Imperial Japanese Navy's rising Red Sun roundel. While the US Navy began preliminary sweeps against Japanese airfields in and around Kagoshima, the British Pacific Fleet contemplated the 6 air bases spread across Ishigaki and Miyako Islands, 2 of the larger islands in the Sakashima chain. Suppression would be challenging. 4 of the airfields were paved and the other 2 were just grass strips, but all could be relatively swiftly repaired with crushed coral, which was easy to apply and very quick to be rolled flat. Thus, as well as the initial efforts to suppress anti-aircraft guns and destroy aircraft, follow-up efforts with constant fighter sweeps and airstrikes targeted at repair equipment as well as cratering the runways would be needed to keep enemy activity down. While doing this, the fleet would also have to keep itself safe from both regular flavour Japanese strikes and the newly minted kamikaze strikes. In aid of this, Corsairs were assigned to high-altitude combat air patrol positions, as they performed well at height and their larger fuel reserves would let them ascend and stay up there for prolonged periods. At low to medium altitudes, the shorter-legged but extremely swift Seafires circled. The Corsairs' job was primarily to deal with the more conventional attacks. The medium-altitude Seafires were to deal with anything that got through the Corsairs, and the low-level aircraft were to deal with lone wolf attacks and kamikazes, which at this stage of the war showed a tendency to approach at wave-top heights. For the first 2 days, the 26th and 27th of March, similar strike patterns were used. 48 Corsairs would hit the airfields with strafing runs, followed up by 2 sets of 24 Avengers apiece, 1 set per island. They would saturate the targets with bombs set with both immediate and delayed action fuses, the latter to disrupt airfield repair efforts, and there would be the occasional detachment of rocket-armed Fireflies, whose heavy 20mm cannon were also useful in shooting up airfield vehicles, particularly the repair vehicles. At one stage, the submarine HMS Undine was sent to recover an Avenger pilot. It failed to find him, but did find a very confused US Navy aviator who'd been shot down over Okinawa 3 days earlier and had drifted an impressively far distance in the intervening time. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony, as shortly thereafter a combined effort by Fleet Air Arm Corsairs and the US submarine Kingfish then found the British pilot. However, poor weather was predicted for the 29th in the Replenishment area, so it was decided to abandon efforts on the 28th and refuel 1 day early. This was done primarily to ensure the British Pacific Fleet would be in top fighting condition for the 31st of March through to the 2nd of April, as the landings on Okinawa were scheduled to begin on the 1st of April, and it was therefore expected that maximum enemy effort would be exerted during this period. Replenishment this time around used a technique that was being experimented with. The fleet and the resupply force formed 2 separate groups. Half the fleet then moved over to resupply while the other half provided cover, and then they would swap. But in practice this proved cumbersome, and so all subsequent refueling operations would use the US Navy's technique, where both resupply and primary fleet force escorts would merge into one giant ring of protection, with the whole of the fleet forming up line abreast inside, alongside the various tankers and storeships. Strikes then resumed on the 31st, using the same pattern of fighter sweeps followed up by Avengers, but with the numbers in each section reduced since the threat was somewhat diminished. The Avengers primarily focusing on putting big craters in the runways now that most of the visible aircraft and buildings had been hit. Having heard of Japanese planes following returning strikes back home from the US Navy, the British Pacific Fleet adopted a version of the US counter to that. In the US Navy, strikes were directed to home in on and then fly over a destroyer, which would then ID each aircraft and either send them on a new course back to the fleet or call in somebody to deal with them. Any Japanese aircraft trying to sneak in would primarily be dealt with either by a summoned combat air patrol fighter, other returning aircraft if they were of a suitable type, or, as a last-ditch measure, the destroyer's own anti-aircraft guns. But since a portion of the British Pacific Fleet's combat air patrol was made up of the shorter endurance Seafires, a cruiser was sent to this position instead, with its heavier anti-aircraft battery now the primary way of dealing with any intruders. The next day, the landings on Okinawa began, and sure enough, there was a surge in Japanese aircraft activity. Just before 0700 in the morning, as Corsairs were sweeping the airfields again, a formation of Japanese aircraft was spotted on radar heading for the fleet. The raid was intercepted and dispersed, with only 4 aircraft making it through. These were pursued largely by the low-level Seafires. 1-0 managed to pull off strafing runs on both Indomitable and King George V, but accomplished little else as the pilot was forced to keep the throttle open just to try and stay alive. Another 0 appeared, and Sub-Lieutenant Reynolds set off in pursuit. He managed to get a long-range barrage of 20mm rounds from his Seafire, smashing into the portside wing of his target. But even as that wing began to fold up, the Japanese pilot used the inadvertent roll to flip into a dive straight down onto the Indefatigable, smashing into the flight deck adjacent to the ship's island. In about 6 weeks' time, a near-identical attack would turn the carrier USS Bunker Hill into an inferno that saw the ship out of service for the rest of the war with around 700 men killed or wounded. In this case, however, the plummeting aircraft pancaked into Indefatigable's armoured flight deck, with the resulting explosion causing around 30 casualties and destroying 3 nearby parked aircraft. However, apart from a small dent in said flight deck, within 3/4 of an hour the fires had been put out and the remains of the aircraft had been shoved over the side, and the ship was back in action. Reynolds had a rather busy day as 20 minutes later another 0 appeared and tried to bomb the destroyer Ulster. He dropped in on the 0's tail and shot it down, only for another 0 to appear even as its compatriot hit the sea. This 0 then tried to dogfight Reynolds, but he exploited the fact that the Seafires had a 600 horsepower advantage in the engine department over the 0 without weighing all that much more than the Japanese fighter, and this translated to a roughly 15 to 20% advantage in terms of power-to-weight ratio, or horsepower per ton. Using this advantage, he simply sustained the fight until the 0 ran out of energy, then dropped in on its tail and sent it down with a burst of 20mm fire as well. 2 more lone raiding aircraft appeared late in the afternoon, but this accomplished nothing after Victorious hauled into a tight turn, forcing the kamikaze that was heading for it to miss, its wingtip just clipping the flight deck, which sent it into a violent cartwheel which caused it to tear itself apart on impact with the water. For all the Japanese efforts, the Seafire's weak undercarriage was more of a threat to the British Pacific Fleet than enemy aircraft were. 1 British Pacific Fleet Avenger had been lost to enemy fire, with its crew rescued by USS Kingfish again, which had elected to stick around, but 3 Seafires had managed to collapse their landing gear when hitting the flight decks in rough seas. Strikes launched the next day found little in the way of enemy activity, and so the fleet decamped back to its resupply position. The growing rough weather complicated these efforts, but it did allow the escort carrier HMS Slinger to fly off replacement aircraft and take aboard flyable but non-combat operational aircraft before heading back for the Leyte Gulf anchorage and the onshore repair facilities there. The 6th of April saw strikes resumed, but again little enemy activity for the British Pacific Fleet, although the US Navy was at that very moment suffering from the single largest kamikaze attack of the war just to the north. It seemed that whilst the British had succeeded in suppressing the Sakashima airfields, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had decided to exploit the long range of most Japanese aircraft, which of course was doubled again if they weren't intending to return, to launch strikes from airfields on Formosa, bypassing Sakashima entirely, as well as launching from air bases further into mainland Japan beyond the belt of airfields that the US carriers had hit. The Japanese were also trying out new tactics, with their lone wolf attacks, which had been fairly successful against the US Navy, being largely shot down or driven off by rapid responses from the combat air patrol of the British ships. At around 5 in the afternoon, the fleet suddenly found the radio frequencies for their fighter control and direction radios being jammed. This was followed shortly thereafter by a wave of Japanese aircraft appearing on radar, and of course there was no way to tell the combat air patrol what was going on. As it turned out, most of the Japanese aircraft were actually still intercepted by the combat air patrol, which just so happened by sheer luck to be circling in the right area at the right time. Most of the others were taken out by anti-aircraft fire, with one kamikaze diving on Illustrious but being thwarted once again by the agility of the British carriers, which were long used to dodging incoming dive bombers in the Mediterranean. Between anti-aircraft fire blasting off a wingtip and a sharp turn to port by the carrier, the aircraft instead just clipped the ship's radar before crashing into the sea alongside, although the large bomb it was carrying caused some underwater damage when it detonated that was not immediately appreciated until a few days later when the ship began to vibrate rather heavily at speed. On the 7th of April, the US Navy advised all ships in the operational area to form up in tight defensive formations against a high chance of heavy enemy air raids. Later on in the day, it was revealed that this had been ordered as it was anticipated the Japanese Navy would try to distract from the sailing of the Yamato in Operation Tengo by launching a big airstrike on the Allied ships. In the end, the massed air attack didn't quite materialize, or rather, a massed air attack did in fact materialize, but all the aircraft involved were American, not Japanese, and they promptly sent Yamato to the bottom in a series of massive attack waves. The only Japanese counter to these events was a kamikaze hit on the carrier USS Hancock, which then had to send itself back to Leyte for repairs. With the Formidable now fully operational and shortly to catch up with the fleet, Admiral Rawlings was able to earmark the badly vibrating Illustrious for a journey back to Sydney for repairs, and he then took the fleet back to its at-sea resupply position. But about 36 hours later, as the fleet headed back to Sakashima on the 9th of April, Admiral Spruance asked them to divert to hit the airfields at the northern end of Formosa instead. This was for several reasons. The Sakashima airfields were by now showing relatively minimal enemy activity, whereas the Formosa airfields had sent up large numbers of aircraft over the past week. The British Pacific Fleet, operating semi-independently, would not reduce Spruance's available flight decks off Okinawa itself, and, as recent events had shown, if the Formosan airfields resulted to a mass kamikaze strike on the incoming carrier force, the tough British carriers were more likely to survive the encounter and remained operational on the front lines. The fleet arrived off Formosa on the 11th of April, but poor weather at sea prevented strikes being flown off, which was much to the cost of 5th Fleet, whose radar pickets would take a beating later that day from kamikazes that had flown off of the Formosan airfields that weren't subject to bad weather. The next day, the cloud base was still low, but the seas were considerably better, and strikes as well as fighter patrols and combat air patrol sections were flown off. Overall, that day's strikes were quite successful. The Japanese units seemed to not actually expect enemy carriers this far from Okinawa, and the airfields put up relatively little anti-aircraft fire, with a number of enemy strike packages, most of which were bound for Okinawa, being intercepted and destroyed by British fighters. A last-minute attempt to attack the fleet was also wiped out to a man by combat air patrol fighters when they were spotted on radar and vectored in. Luckily, a tragedy was avoided when a PB-4Y Liberator in US Navy colours flew through the area with its IFF systems off and running radio silent. Amidst the clouds, a Seafire was directed to attack the unknown contact, but after failing to score a hit with a long-range burst of fire, the fighter closed through the clouds, emerging almost on top of the bomber, but the pilot just about held off on the trigger at the last minute as the extremely close range allowed a distinct visual identification of the target as a friendly. By this stage, the British Pacific Fleet was able to exploit a rather unique capability in its fighter direction efforts. The British air early warning and direction radar suites designed for the task were actually more powerful and longer range than the American SM-1 units. But one of the SM-1s had been installed on the Indomitable, and the SM-1 was more accurate when it came to determining the exact height of the enemy. By combining the information from the two types of radar, the British fighter direction officers were able to dispatch combat air patrol fighters considerably earlier by using the contacts on the longer-range British radars, but then, as the two forces closed, they were able to refine their directions more precisely as enemy aircraft crossed into the range of the SM-1 unit, which meant highly accurate interceptions could be made of Japanese formations at a considerable distance from the fleet. Admiral Rawlings was so pleased with his success that he signalled Admiral Spruance that he could actually head back to Sakashima if desired before the fleet headed back to Leyte to fully restock, since it appeared that in the week since the British Pacific Fleet had left the area, the Japanese had restarted aerial activities on the Sakashima airfields, even diverting aircraft that were otherwise heading for Formosa, since those airfields were obviously now under attack. Spruance responded, "This is fine initiative and cooperation. Cover Sakashima 16th and 17th of April unless otherwise directed prior to that time." Since it was still only the 12th, the fleet took the chance to hit Formosa again before leaving, as well as intercepting another new kind of Japanese raid. This one made up of a small group of dive bombers centered on a single aircraft which was equipped with an air-to-surface search radar to help direct them to their target. It was wiped out almost to a man. The subsequent raids on the Sakashima Islands revealed there were indeed more aircraft present than before, but these offered relatively little resistance to 2 days of ongoing strikes. One change, though, at this point was made to the combat air patrol routine. Since the Seafire had shown itself to be its own worst enemy, with almost none lost to enemy action but many lost to collapsing landing gear or broken backs when they landed, it was decided to use mostly Fireflies in the lower to medium altitude combat air patrol positions. Their heavy firepower and long endurance was quite useful for this role in any case, and most of the Seafires were then placed on hot standby on deck. If no enemy air raids materialised, then they wouldn't have to take off, and only a few Seafires would thus actually need to fly combat air patrol. Therefore, the dwindling stocks of the aircraft could be conserved. But in fact, so successful were these 2 days of strikes with relatively minimal losses that Admiral Rawlings offered another day of strikes after he'd resupplied to Admiral Spruance, who accepted. And these strikes, after a brief pit stop at the fleet train to refuel, went in almost unopposed, with Fireflies finding so much on fire at the airfields they decided to go off and shoot up some coastal shipping instead. With that done, the British Pacific Fleet finally headed for Leyte Gulf, 32 days after leaving Ulithi and almost 2 months since leaving Sydney. Almost 2,500 sorties had been flown, with 134 enemy aircraft destroyed. 64 British Pacific Fleet aircraft had been written off during the engagements, although the majority had either wrecked themselves upon landing, including 25 Seafires, or else had been consigned to the deep after having landed successfully, but having been deemed too badly damaged to repair. Only a relative minority were actual combat losses. Reflecting on the British Pacific Fleet's first proper frontline deployment, Admiral Vian could be happy with many things. None of his carriers had needed to be sent home directly due to combat damage, with the possible exception of Illustrious, but that was more a case of a final straw compounding various other damages occurred during 5 years of war, and generally his sorties per day per aircraft were approximately similar to US Navy levels of activity, with the sole exception of the Seafire, which he wasn't a great fan of. The sheer number of sea fires written off in accidents had caused their sortie rate to drop to about 3/4 that of the other aircraft types. And of course, with its smaller fuel tanks, each sortie was only about half as long as that of, say, a Corsair or a Hellcat. The short range meant that they were only really useful for combat air patrol, and they couldn't accompany aircraft on strikes. There were some plus points to the type. The small group of Seafires that hadn't managed to self-destruct actually had an operational rate which was about similar to the other fighters, so if something could be done to fix their structural weaknesses, that issue wouldn't be so much of a problem. And although limited to combat air patrol, they were actually fairly good at it, both in terms of basic measures like their performance and firepower, but also because their profile was very distinct from almost anything in the Japanese arsenal. A few of the British Pacific Fleet's Hellcats and Corsairs had been shot down by their own side's anti-aircraft guns while in active pursuit of Japanese aircraft, when the gunners had just seen a bunch of fast-moving radial engine aircraft coming in their general direction and opened up at everything. It was hoped that the worst of the problems could have some solutions, even if temporary ones, found by the time HMS Implacable arrived, as she was equipped with quite a few Seafires, much like Indefatigable had been just before over 24 of them had broken themselves on her flight deck. It was also hoped that the single largest cause of aircraft losses in combat, enemy anti-aircraft fire over airfields, might be further reduced thanks to some of the latest information that was coming from Spruance's formation, who'd found that Avengers and Corsairs releasing bombs from 3,000 feet, as opposed to the previous 1,000 to 1,500 foot recommended drop altitude, had actually made relatively little difference to overall accuracy, but had managed to cut losses from medium anti-aircraft gunfire by about a third, and from light anti-aircraft gunfire by almost half. Combat air patrol was, however, seen as an area for improvement, although American liaison officers had been stunned to see the British Pacific Fleet break up and destroy entire incoming enemy strike waves repeatedly with great efficiency with just a dozen fighters on station, thanks to excellent fighter control and direction. The Royal Navy officers felt that if they could sustain 20 aircraft on combat air patrol in future, the results would be even better. Thanks were also sent to Spruance for the loan of a number of US Navy liaison officers, who'd helped iron out a few issues surrounding the mounting of large airstrikes, and it had been largely thanks to them that the fleet had rapidly transitioned into sending strikes totaling around 100 aircraft at a time in on enemy targets on a regular basis. They also had a number of useful tips on improving the turnaround time of aircraft strike operations based on their own experience aboard US Navy fleet carriers. In turn, the US liaison officers sent back a number of glowing reports on the seemingly preternatural ability of British carriers to actively dodge incoming kamikazes and then tank the few hits that made it into physical contact. As the fleet restocked back at Leyte, intense activity was to be seen on all ships. The damage from the kamikaze hit to Indefatigable's island was patched up, and Unicorn was seen to be distributing new aircraft day and night like some kind of demented flat-top Santa. Her specialised aircraft transfer lighters keeping aircraft moving to the fleet carriers, even when pilots weren't available to fly the planes in directly. Various specialist repair ships were fabricating parts, while anything that floated was being used to take supplies back and forth across the harbour, including a number of small landing craft which were impressed into service. Unicorn and Deer Sound, a ship which was entirely devoted to the repair of aircraft engines, were also kept busy modifying aircraft which were being delivered by the string of escort carriers coming up from Sydney and Manus, in line with new requirements that had been drawn up in light of experience on the recent deployment. There was also light at the end of the tunnel for the wildly varying fleet train, as several waves of Victory ships had arrived. Their standardized hull and machinery, together with a large cargo capacity, above average speed, and the fact that they were absolutely brand new, allowed some of the older and more difficult to operate cargo ships in the fleet train to be released to other duties. The Victory ship's large decks and significant existing king post cranes also made Victory ships an ideal setup for rapid adaptation to specific uses, such as mass dry stores transfer. This would also serve to lessen the number of craft seen crisscrossing the bay, as the existing fleet's mix of sizes and capacities when it came to store ships meant that a great many ships' boats were out on shopping expeditions, finding out which ships had particular stores aboard and then trying to secure them for their own home ship. It was hoped that as more and more victory ships arrived, they would all be able to have standardized sets of stores aboard for a given role, which would minimize the time spent wandering around looking to see who had a spare 5.25-inch shell or the landing gear oleos for a Firefly. With all this accomplished, the British Pacific Fleet would set sail again on the 1st of May, heading back for Sakashima for Phase 2 of Operation Iceberg. It couldn't come soon enough. A force of US Navy escort carriers had attempted to keep up the pressure on the Japanese airfields, but they'd lacked the numbers, and air operations on the island had therefore recovered to an extent. The increase in Japanese air operations had been telling, with the carriers Enterprise and Intrepid being damaged and forced to fall back. The USS Shangri-La had arrived, which partially made up for it, but combined with the previously damaged carriers mentioned earlier in the video, Task Group 58.2 had to be dissolved entirely, with the remaining carriers from that group, the Essex-class Randolph and the light carrier Independence, being used to reinforce the diminished Task Groups 58.3 and 58.4. On the 4th of May 1945, the first combat air patrol fighters took off for Operation Iceberg 2, and the British Pacific Fleet was back in action.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.